The morning light filtered through the stained-glass windows of First Baptist Church in Millbrook, Tennessee, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews where the Henderson family had sat every Sunday for 3 generations. 16-year-old Emma Henderson clutched her grandmother's leather-bound Bible, running her fingers along its cracked spine as Pastor Williams delivered his sermon about faith in times of uncertainty. She had no way of knowing that within hours she would disappear without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt her family for 16 years. If this reminds you of someone who vanished from your life without warning, someone whose absence still echoes in quiet moments, share this story with those who remember them too. Emma's father, David Henderson, later told investigators that his daughter seemed different that morning. She had lingered at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate while staring out the kitchen window at the rolling hills that surrounded their small town. Her mother, Linda, noticed she held the old Bible closer than usual, whispering prayers between hymns with an intensity that seemed beyond her 16 years. The Henderson family owned a modest farm on the outskirts of Millbrook, where David grew soybeans and Linda ran a small quilting business from their converted barn. Emma, their only child born after years of hoping, was the light of their world. She helped her mother with the intricate stitching patterns, sang in the church choir, and dreamed of studying art at the University of Tennessee. Her drawings filled notebooks and covered the walls of her bedroom, detailed sketches of flowers, portraits of church members, and abstract patterns that seemed to flow from some deep well of creativity within her. That Sunday afternoon, after the family returned from church, Emma excused herself to walk to Miller's Creek, a shallow stream that wound through the Henderson property. She often went there to sketch, finding inspiration in the way sunlight danced on the water, or how wildflowers bent in the gentle Tennessee breeze. Linda packed her daughter a thermos of sweet tea and a peanut butter sandwich, kissing her forehead before watching her walk down the familiar dirt path that led through the oak grove. The path was one Emma had traveled countless times since childhood. She knew every root that jutted up from the earth, every bend where blackberry bushes grew thick in summer, every spot where deer came to drink at twilight. The creek held her childhood memories, catching minnows with her bare hands, building fairy houses from twigs and moss, lying on her back watching clouds shift into familiar shapes. It was her sanctuary, her place of peace. David expected Emma home by supper time, as was their family tradition. When 6 o'clock arrived without her usual call of, "Mama, I'm home!" echoing through the screen door, Linda felt the first flutter of worry in her chest. By 7, when the sun began its descent behind the hills and Emma still hadn't returned, both parents walked the creek path, calling her name until their voices grew hoarse. They found her sketchbook lying open beside the water, its pages fluttering in the evening breeze. A half-finished drawing of water lilies remained, the pencil strokes delicate and precise, exactly as Emma would have made them. Her thermos sat upright on a flat rock, still half full of sweet tea, and the untouched sandwich rested in its brown paper bag. There were no signs of struggle, no disturbed ground, no indication that anything violent had occurred. Emma had simply vanished, as if she had been lifted from the earth itself. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, arrived within an hour of David's panicked phone call. Bradley had known Emma since she was born, had watched her grow from a shy child who hid behind her mother's skirts to a confident teenager who volunteered at the church nursery and helped elderly neighbors with their grocery shopping. He organized search parties that combed every inch of Henderson property and beyond, bringing in tracking dogs and volunteers from neighboring counties. For 3 weeks, the search consumed the small town. Volunteers arrived at dawn and stayed until darkness made it impossible to continue. They searched barns and abandoned buildings, dragged ponds and creek beds, followed every deer trail and logging road within a 50-mile radius. Emma's face appeared on missing person flyers posted in every store window, on every telephone pole, in every church bulletin across eastern Tennessee. Linda Henderson barely ate or slept during those weeks, spending her days walking the creek path and her nights sitting in Emma's room, touching her daughter's belongings and praying for answers that never came. David threw himself into the search with desperate determination, organizing volunteer schedules and coordinating with law enforcement agencies. Neither parent could accept that their daughter had simply vanished without explanation. The FBI eventually joined the investigation, bringing federal resources and expertise to what had become a case that defied explanation. Special Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in missing persons cases, interviewed everyone who had contact with Emma in the weeks before her disappearance. Teachers, classmates, church members, and family friends all painted the same picture of a happy, well-adjusted teenager with strong family ties and no reason to run away. As autumn turned to winter and winter melted into spring, the active search scaled down to periodic efforts and the case grew cold. Emma Henderson had become another statistic, another face on a missing person database, another family destroyed by unanswered questions. The Henderson farm, once filled with Emma's laughter and dreams, settled into a heavy silence that would endure for 16 long years. The years that followed Emma Henderson's disappearance transformed the fabric of Millbrook in ways both visible and profound. The small Tennessee town, once characterized by the comfortable rhythms of rural life, now carried the weight of collective grief and unanswered questions. Every family gathering, every church service, every community event was marked by Emma's absence, a silence that grew louder with each passing year. David and Linda Henderson aged decades in the span of months following their daughter's disappearance. The farm that had once been their pride became a burden they could barely manage. David's strong hands, weathered by years of working the soil, now trembled when he tried to concentrate on simple tasks. The soybeans still grew in neat rows across their fields, but he worked them mechanically, his mind always elsewhere, always searching for answers that remained just beyond his reach. Linda's quilting business, which had once brought joy and extra income to their household, dwindled to nothing. The converted barn where she had spent countless hours creating intricate patterns now stood empty, her sewing machine covered with a dusty sheet. She couldn't bear to touch the colorful fabrics that reminded her of Emma's artistic spirit, couldn't find comfort in the meditative process of stitching pieces together when her own life felt so completely torn apart. The couple's marriage, once strong enough to weather any storm, began to show cracks under the relentless pressure of grief and uncertainty. They grieved differently. David throwing himself into private investigation efforts, hiring search specialists and following every possible lead, while Linda withdrew inward, spending hours in Emma's unchanged bedroom, holding her daughter's clothes, and whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have stopped listening. Sheriff Tom Bradley, now graying at the temples and carrying extra weight from stress and sleepless nights, kept Emma's case file on his desk where he could see it every day. He had worked dozens of missing person cases in his 20-year career, but none had haunted him like Emma's disappearance. The complete lack of evidence, the absence of any logical explanation, went against everything his experience had taught him about how people vanish. Bradley had followed every possible lead over the years. He investigated reports of Emma sightings from as far away as California and Florida, each one ultimately proving false but still worth pursuing. He questioned registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius, examined financial records for any unusual activity, and maintained regular contact with the FBI's database of unidentified remains. Every few months he would drive out to the Henderson farm and walk the creek path himself, hoping to notice some detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The church where Emma had sung in the choir struggled to maintain the sense of community that had once defined it. Pastor Williams, now in his 70s, delivered sermons about faith and trust in God's plan, but the words felt hollow when faced with the reality of Emma's absence. The congregation had prayed for her safe return every Sunday for the first year, then gradually shifted to praying for peace for the Henderson family. The community had done everything they knew how to do, and still Emma remained gone. Emma's classmates graduated, left for college, started careers, and began families of their own. Her best friend, Jessica Martinez, became a teacher and named her first daughter Emma in honor of her missing friend. Jessica often found herself scanning crowds at public events, hoping against reason to catch a glimpse of the girl who had vanished on that ordinary Sunday afternoon. She kept Emma's senior year school photo on her dresser, a reminder of dreams interrupted and questions that might never be answered. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, ran anniversary articles about Emma's disappearance each year for the first 5 years, then gradually moved on to more current stories. But editor Margaret Foster, who had covered Emma's disappearance from the beginning, kept every piece of information about the case in a thick file folder in her office. She had developed a personal investment in finding answers, partly because of her journalistic instincts, and partly because she had daughters of her own. As the years accumulated, theories about Emma's fate evolved within the community. Some believed she had been abducted by someone passing through town. Others wondered if she had somehow staged her own disappearance to escape some unknown problem. A few suggested that she might have had a secret boyfriend, or been involved in something dangerous that her parents never knew about. But those who knew Emma best found these theories impossible to reconcile with the girl they remembered, responsible, family-oriented, deeply rooted in her faith and community. The creek where Emma disappeared became a place of pilgrimage for the Henderson family and others who remembered her. Linda walked there almost daily for the first several years, sometimes carrying flowers, sometimes just sitting on the rock where Emma's thermos had been found. The water lilies that Emma had been sketching when she vanished continued to bloom each summer, a natural memorial that seemed both beautiful and heartbreaking. David, meanwhile, became obsessed with investigating similar cases across the country. He joined online forums for families of missing persons, studied FBI statistics, and corresponded with private investigators who specialized in cold cases. He spent his evenings hunched over his computer, following digital trails that led nowhere, cross-referencing databases that offered no comfort. The once social farmer became increasingly isolated, driven by a desperate need to find answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. The FBI's involvement in Emma's case gradually diminished as more urgent matters demanded their attention. Special Agent Sarah Chen maintained periodic contact with the Henderson family and local law enforcement, but without new evidence or leads, there was little active investigation to pursue. Emma's case joined the thousands of others in federal databases, waiting for some new piece of information that might crack it open. As the 10th anniversary of Emma's disappearance approached, both David and Linda Henderson had to face the possibility that they might never know what happened to their daughter. The hope that had sustained them through the early years had been worn down by disappointment and the relentless passage of time. Yet they could not bring themselves to hold a memorial service or declare Emma legally dead. Somewhere deep in their hearts, they still believed that answers might come, that their daughter's story was not over. The town of Millbrook, too, had learned to live with the mystery of Emma Henderson's disappearance. Her case had become part of the community's collective memory, a reminder of how quickly life could change, and how some questions defied all attempts at answers. But time has a way of revealing truths that were hidden, and sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected places. 16 years after Emma Henderson's disappearance, an unlikely discovery would reignite the investigation that had long grown cold. The catalyst came not from law enforcement or professional investigators, but from the patient dedication of an elderly church volunteer who understood that some mysteries hide in the most sacred places. Martha Caldwell had been the church librarian at First Baptist Church in Millbrook for over 30 years. At 73, she moved slowly through the dusty back rooms, where boxes of donated Bibles, hymn books, and religious texts waited to be cataloged and distributed to missions or placed in the church's lending library. Her arthritis made the work painful, but Martha found purpose in ensuring that every donated book found its proper place. She believed that God's Word deserved careful attention, no matter how old or worn the vessel that contained it. On a humid Tuesday morning in late July 2023, Martha was sorting through a collection of Bibles that had been donated after the recent passing of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a longtime church member who had lived to be 96. Mrs. Whitfield's family had brought 5 boxes of religious books, explaining that their grandmother had collected Bibles throughout her life, often buying them at estate sales and thrift stores, with the intention of giving them to people who needed spiritual guidance. Martha worked methodically through the boxes, checking each Bible for damage, noting the edition and publisher, and occasionally finding handwritten notes or pressed flowers between the pages. It was routine work that she found meditative, a quiet service to her faith and community. She had processed thousands of donated books over the years, understanding that each one carried its own history of hopes, prayers, and personal connection to the divine. The Bible that would change everything appeared unremarkable at first glance. It was a King James version with a worn brown leather cover, published in 1978 by Thomas Nelson. The gilt lettering on the cover had faded, and the binding showed the gentle wear of regular use. Martha opened it carefully, as was her habit, to check the condition of the pages and look for any personal inscriptions that might indicate its previous owner. Inside the front cover, written in faded blue ink, was the inscription: "To Emma, on your confirmation day. May God's love guide your path always. Love, Grandma Rose." Below the inscription, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Emma Henderson, First Baptist Church, Millbrook, TN." Martha's hands began to shake as she recognized the name. Emma Henderson, the girl who had vanished 16 years ago, whose disappearance had haunted their entire community. Martha remembered Emma well, remembered her sitting in the third pew with her parents every Sunday, remembered her clear voice in the church choir, remembered the prayers they had offered for her safe return week after week until hope began to fade. But it was what Martha discovered as she carefully turned the pages that made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. Throughout the Bible, Emma had made small, precise drawings in the margins. They weren't random doodles, but carefully planned illustrations that seemed to tell a story. There were sketches of birds in cages, flowers growing behind high fences, and groups of people with their faces turned upward toward a single figure standing on what appeared to be a raised platform. The drawings were executed with the same delicate precision that Martha remembered from Emma's artwork displayed at school art shows and church events. But these illustrations carried a darker undertone than Emma's usually bright, optimistic creations. There was something urgent about them, something that suggested they were more than artistic expressions. They seemed to be trying to communicate something important. Martha found herself drawn to one particular page in the Book of Psalms, where Emma had created her most detailed drawing. It showed a compound of buildings surrounded by a high fence, topped with what looked like barbed wire. Inside the compound, small figures appeared to be working in gardens or fields, while larger figures stood watching them. At the center of the compound was a building with a cross on top, and standing in front of it was a tall man with his arms raised toward the sky. Around this central illustration, Emma had written small words and phrases in the margins. "The shepherd watches his flock," "Many rooms in my Father's house," and "The harvest is ready, but the workers are few." The words appeared to be biblical references, but they felt ominous in the context of the drawings, as if Emma was using familiar religious language to describe something far more troubling. Martha studied the drawing with increasing alarm, noting details that seemed significant: the high fence, the watching figures, the sense of isolation from the outside world. She recognized the artistic style as definitively Emma's, the way she drew faces in profile, the particular way she rendered trees and buildings, the careful attention to small details that made her artwork distinctive. As Martha continued through the Bible, she found more drawings and notations. There were sketches of what appeared to be dormitory-style rooms with multiple beds, communal dining areas where people sat at long tables, and work areas where figures bent over plants or tended to animals. Throughout these illustrations, Emma had placed small symbols that seemed to form a pattern: tiny crosses, stars, and what looked like letters or numbers that might represent some kind of code. Martha's discovery was even more significant because of how the Bible had come to be in Mrs. Whitfield's collection. According to the donation records that came with the books, Mrs. Whitfield had purchased this particular Bible at an estate sale in 2008, just 1 year after Emma's disappearance. The estate sale had taken place in a neighboring county, about 40 miles from Millbrook, at the home of someone named Rebecca Morris. Martha immediately called Sheriff Bradley, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what she had found. Bradley, now nearing retirement but still carrying the weight of Emma's unsolved case, listened with growing amazement as Martha described the drawings and their apparent significance. He arranged to meet her at the church within the hour, bringing with him the original case file that he had maintained for 16 years. When Bradley examined the Bible and Emma's drawings, he felt a combination of hope and dread that he hadn't experienced since the early days of the investigation. The artwork was undeniably Emma's. He had seen enough of her drawings during the initial investigation to recognize her distinctive style. But the content of the drawings suggested that Emma had been alive after her disappearance, and that she had been trying to leave some kind of message about where she was being held. The discovery of Emma's Bible raised as many questions as it answered. How had it ended up in Rebecca Morris's possession? Was Rebecca Morris connected to Emma's disappearance? Or had she unknowingly purchased a Bible that contained crucial evidence? Most importantly, were the drawings a map to where Emma had been taken? And could they lead to answers about what had happened to her? Bradley immediately contacted the FBI to report the discovery. Special Agent Sarah Chen, who had worked on Emma's original case, was now based in Nashville but agreed to drive to Millbrook immediately to examine the evidence. As she studied Emma's drawings, Chen felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven her throughout her career in law enforcement. After 16 years, Emma Henderson was reaching out from the past, possibly providing the key to solving her own disappearance. The investigation that had been dormant for years was about to explode back to life, and this time, They had Emma's own hand guiding them toward the truth. The discovery of Emma's Bible set off a chain of investigative activity that transformed the quiet sheriff's office in Millbrook into a bustling center of law enforcement cooperation. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen arrived from Nashville with a team of specialists, bringing advanced forensic equipment and database access that would be crucial to interpreting Emma's coded drawings. Sheriff Bradley, energized by the first real lead in 16 years, worked alongside federal agents with the determination of a man who had never forgotten the girl who vanished from his community. The first breakthrough came from forensic analysis of the Bible itself. Fingerprint experts found Emma's prints on several pages, confirming what they already knew, that she had handled the book and created the drawings. More importantly, they found additional fingerprints that didn't match Emma or any known members of her family. These unknown prints were immediately run through federal databases, but they didn't match any known criminals or suspects from the original investigation. Agent Chen assembled a team of specialists to analyze Emma's drawings, including an FBI behavioral analyst, a cult expert, and a forensic art specialist who had experience interpreting coded messages and artwork. The consensus was that Emma's illustrations weren't random artistic expressions, but deliberate attempts to document her surroundings and communicate information about her situation. The compound she had drawn showed clear evidence of being some kind of controlled environment, possibly a religious community or cult that isolated its members from the outside world. The investigation into Rebecca Morris, the previous owner of the Bible, began immediately. Records showed that Rebecca Morris had died in 2007, just a few months after Emma's disappearance. She had been 91 years old and living alone in a farmhouse in Carter County, Tennessee. Her estate sale had been handled by her nephew, Michael Morris, who lived in Kentucky and had inherited her property. When agents contacted Michael Morris, he provided information that proved crucial to understanding how Emma's Bible had ended up in his aunt's collection. According to Michael, Rebecca Morris had been visited in her final months by members of a religious group who called themselves the, quote, Covenant of the Sacred Harvest. These people had reportedly provided care and companionship to elderly Rebecca, helping with household chores and bringing food from their community garden. Michael Morris remembered being surprised by his aunt's association with the group, because Rebecca had been a lifelong Methodist who rarely discussed religion beyond attending church on Sundays. But in her final year, she had spoken frequently about the blessed community that was helping her, and she had accumulated a collection of religious items that he assumed had been gifts from the group. When Rebecca died, Michael had found Bibles, religious artwork, and handwritten prayers among her possessions, which he had assumed were gifts from her new friends. This information led investigators to research the Covenant of the Sacred Harvest, a name that hadn't appeared in any previous investigations related to Emma's disappearance. Initial database searches revealed very little official information about the group, but online research and inquiries with other law enforcement agencies began to paint a disturbing picture of a religious community that exhibited many characteristics of a controlling cult. The Covenant of the Sacred Harvest appeared to have been founded in the mid-1990s by a man named Ezekiel Crowder, who claimed to be a prophet chosen by God to prepare the faithful for the end times. The group operated several rural properties in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, living communally and following Crowder's interpretation of biblical teachings. Members were encouraged to cut ties with outside family and friends, donating their possessions to the community, and submitting to Crowder's spiritual authority. Former members who had escaped from the group described living conditions that matched many elements of Emma's drawings. They spoke of dormitory-style housing, communal meals, mandatory work in gardens and farms, and strict control over communication with the outside world. Most disturbing was their description of Crowder's practice of claiming young women for spiritual marriages, regardless of their age or consent. Several former members mentioned that Crowder had a particular interest in teenagers who showed artistic or musical talents. The behavioral analyst working on Emma's drawings identified several elements that suggested she had been held against her will in a controlled environment. The recurring images of fences and barriers, the watchful figures positioned throughout the compound, and the symbolic use of caged birds all pointed to someone documenting their captivity. Most significantly, the progression of drawings throughout the Bible showed increasing sophistication in coding information, as if Emma had been developing a system to hide her message from anyone who might discover her artwork. Agent Chen coordinated with state and local law enforcement agencies across Tennessee and North Carolina to locate current and former properties associated with the Covenant of the Sacred Harvest. The investigation revealed that the group had operated at least 4 different compounds over the years, moving periodically when they attracted unwanted attention from authorities or when former members reported their activities to law enforcement. The most promising lead came from a tip provided by a former member named Rachel Stewart, who had escaped from the group in 2010. Stewart, now in her 30s and living under an assumed name in Georgia, had seen news coverage of Emma's discovery and contacted the FBI through an anonymous tip line. She reported that during her time with the Covenant, she had known a young woman who matched Emma's description and who had been brought to the compound around 2007 or 2008. According to Stewart, the girl had been called Hannah within the community and had been designated as one of Crowder's spiritual wives, despite being obviously underage. Stewart remembered that Hannah was artistically talented and had been forced to create religious artwork and decorations for the compound. Most importantly, Stewart remembered that Hannah had been caught trying to smuggle messages to the outside world by hiding coded drawings in Bibles and other religious materials that were given to elderly people in surrounding communities. Stewart's testimony provided investigators with crucial information about the Covenant's modus operandi. The group deliberately targeted isolated elderly people, providing them with help and companionship while gradually introducing religious materials and recruiting them as supporters. This practice explained how Emma's Bible had ended up in Rebecca Morris's possession. It had been part of the group's outreach efforts, and Emma had used it as a way to try to communicate with the outside world. The investigation now focused on locating Ezekiel Crowder and any current members of the Covenant of the Sacred Harvest. Financial records showed that Crowder had been careful to keep the group's assets in different names and locations, making it difficult to track their current whereabouts. But the FBI's resources, combined with cooperation from multiple state agencies, began to develop a clearer picture of the group's recent activities. Property records revealed that a man named Elias Crawford, believed to be an alias used by Ezekiel Crowder, had purchased a 500-acre farm in rural North Carolina in 2019. The property was remote, surrounded by forest, and accessible only by a single dirt road that passed through several miles of wilderness. Satellite imagery showed buildings that matched the layout Emma had drawn in her Bible, including a central building with a cross, dormitory-style structures, and extensive fenced areas for gardens and livestock. As evidence mounted pointing to this North Carolina compound, Agent Chen began planning a coordinated operation to investigate the property and search for any sign that Emma Henderson might still be alive. After 16 years of questions and heartbreak, the investigation was finally moving toward what might be answers, though none of the investigators could predict what those answers might reveal about Emma's fate or the years she had been missing. The preparation for this operation would require careful planning and significant resources, but everyone involved understood that they might be approaching the culmination of one of the longest-running missing person cases in Tennessee history. Emma's own artwork had provided the roadmap. Now it remained to follow that map to its conclusion. The investigation into the North Carolina compound required weeks of careful surveillance and planning before law enforcement could move forward with a search operation. FBI tactical teams worked with local authorities to establish observation points in the surrounding forest, using advanced surveillance equipment to monitor the property and document the activities of its inhabitants. What they observed confirmed many of the details Emma had captured in her biblical drawings, but also raised new questions about what they might find when they finally entered the compound. Aerial surveillance revealed a community of approximately 40 people living within the fenced compound. The property contained multiple buildings arranged much as Emma had drawn them, a central structure topped with a large wooden cross, several dormitory-style buildings, communal areas, extensive gardens, and workshops where residents appeared to engage in various forms of manual labor. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded the entire property, and guards were positioned at regular intervals, watching both inward and outward, as if monitoring the residents as much as protecting them from outside threats. The behavioral analysis of the compound's daily routines painted a picture of a highly controlled environment where residents followed rigid schedules under constant supervision. Meals were taken communally at set times, work assignments appeared to be mandatory and closely monitored, and there were no signs of residents coming or going freely. Most concerning was the apparent age range of the residents. Surveillance identified what appeared to be numerous teenagers and young adults, many of whom showed signs of being under some form of coercion or control. Agent Chin coordinated with federal prosecutors to obtain search warrants based on the evidence from Emma's Bible, testimony from former members, and current surveillance of suspected criminal activity. The warrants authorized a comprehensive search of the property for evidence of kidnapping, human trafficking, and other federal crimes. Given the isolated location and the potentially dangerous nature of the group's leadership, the operation was planned as a coordinated tactical entry involving FBI SWAT teams, local law enforcement, and medical personnel prepared to treat anyone who might need immediate care. Sheriff Bradley, though now officially retired, had been granted special permission to participate in the operation as a consultant. After carrying the weight of Emma's case for 16 years, he felt compelled to be present when the investigation potentially reached its conclusion. The night before the operation, he sat in his truck outside the Henderson farm, looking across the fields toward Miller's Creek, where Emma had vanished all those years ago, wondering what they might find when dawn broke over the North Carolina mountains. David and Linda Henderson had been informed about the discovery of Emma's Bible and the planned search of the compound, but they were not told the specific timing of the operation. Agent Chen made this decision partly for operational security and partly to protect the family from what might be devastating disappointment if the search didn't provide the answers they had waited so long to find. The Hendersons were staying with Linda's sister in Nashville, close enough to be contacted immediately if Emma was found, but far enough away to avoid the media attention that would inevitably surround the operation. The tactical entry began at dawn on a crisp October morning, with teams positioned at multiple points around the compound's perimeter. The operation was designed to be swift and overwhelming, preventing any attempt by the group's leadership to hide evidence or harm residents. Helicopters provided aerial support while ground teams cut through the perimeter fencing and advanced toward the central buildings. The residents of the compound initially showed no resistance to the law enforcement presence, instead gathering in the central courtyard with an eerie calm that suggested they had been conditioned to respond to authority without question. Many appeared malnourished and showed signs of psychological trauma, staring blankly at the tactical officers while waiting for instructions. The absence of panic or confusion suggested that these people had been living under such strict control that even a law enforcement raid felt like just another form of external authority imposing its will upon them. Ezekiel Crowder, now in his 70s with long gray hair and wearing simple work clothes, was found in his private quarters within the central building. He showed no surprise at the arrival of law enforcement, instead proclaiming that he had been expecting this day because God had revealed to him in visions that the forces of Satan would eventually come to test his faith. He submitted to arrest without resistance, but his calm demeanor and cryptic statements suggested a man who believed his cause was righteous regardless of earthly consequences. The search of the compound's buildings revealed evidence of the controlled environment that Emma had documented in her drawings. Dormitory rooms contained multiple beds with minimal personal possessions, suggesting that residents owned little beyond basic clothing and toiletries. A communal dining hall featured long tables and benches exactly as Emma had drawn them, while workshops contained evidence of forced labor in woodworking, textile production, and food processing operations. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed records that Crowder had maintained about each resident of the compound. These files contained personal information, family backgrounds, and what appeared to be psychological profiles used to maintain control over individuals who had joined or been brought to the community. The files revealed that many residents had been recruited during vulnerable periods in their lives, after family deaths, during financial crises, or while struggling with addiction or mental health issues. But it was in Crowder's private study that investigators found the evidence they had been hoping for. Among hundreds of religious texts, handwritten sermons, and personal journals, they discovered Emma's sketchbook, the one that had been missing from Miller's Creek on the day she disappeared 16 years earlier. The sketchbook contained dozens of her characteristic drawings, but also detailed maps of the various compounds where the Covenant had operated over the years, along with names and descriptions of other young women who had been held against their will. The sketchbook revealed that Emma had been systematically documenting the group's criminal activities, creating a visual record of human trafficking, forced labor, and sexual exploitation that spanned nearly a decade. Her artistic talent had become a tool of resistance, allowing her to gather evidence while appearing to comply with demands for religious artwork. The progression of her work showed increasing sophistication as she learned to hide coded information within seemingly innocent religious illustrations. Emma's final entries in the sketchbook were dated just 3 months earlier, indicating that she had been alive and actively documenting the group's activities as recently as the summer of 2023. But there was no sign of Emma herself anywhere on the compound. When questioned about her whereabouts, Crowder claimed that Hannah had been called home by the Lord and refused to provide any additional information about what had happened to her. The investigation of the compound would take weeks to complete, as forensic teams processed hundreds of pieces of evidence and social workers interviewed the rescued residents. But the immediate priority was locating Emma Henderson and determining whether she was still alive somewhere, possibly at another property controlled by the Covenant or held by associates of the group who had not been present during the raid. The discovery of Emma's sketchbook proved that she had survived her abduction and had spent years trying to expose the criminal organization that had held her captive. But it also raised the terrifying possibility that her recent absence from the compound might mean that she had been discovered and eliminated as a threat to the group's operations. The investigation that had begun with hope now carried an urgent sense of racing against time to find Emma before it was too late. The aftermath of the compound raid transformed the investigation into Emma Henderson's disappearance from a cold case into one of the FBI's highest priority operations. The evidence found at the North Carolina facility revealed the existence of a criminal network far more extensive and sophisticated than investigators had initially realized, with connections spanning multiple states and involving dozens of victims over nearly 2 decades. Emma's detailed documentation had provided law enforcement with a roadmap to dismantling the entire organization, but it had also intensified the urgency of finding her before those who remained free could eliminate the witness whose artwork threatened their continued operations. Agent Chen established a task force headquarters in Asheville, North Carolina, bringing together federal agents, state investigators, and local law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions. The rescued residents from the compound were taken to a secure facility where medical professionals and counselors began the delicate process of helping them recover from years of psychological manipulation and physical control. Many were so traumatized that they could provide only limited information about the group's operations, but their testimony gradually revealed the scope of the Covenant's criminal activities. Among the rescued residents were 3 young women who had been designated as Crowder's spiritual wives, and who could provide crucial information about Emma's time at the compound. They confirmed that Emma, known to them as Hannah, had been one of Crowder's favorites because of her artistic abilities. She had been forced to create religious artwork, decorations, and promotional materials for the group, but had also been tasked with visiting elderly community members to provide spiritual comfort and deliver religious materials, a practice that had allowed her to place coded messages in Bibles and other items. The women revealed that Emma had been planning an escape attempt and had been secretly communicating with someone on the outside, though they didn't know the identity of her contact. According to their testimony, Crowder had become suspicious of Emma's activities in recent months and had assigned additional guards to watch her. The last time any of them had seen Emma was in late July 2023, when she had been taken from the compound by several of Crowder's trusted associates, ostensibly for a quote-quote-quote spiritual retreat at another location. This timeline corresponded roughly with when Martha Caldwell had discovered Emma's Bible at the church in Millbrook, suggesting that Emma's final coded message had been successfully delivered just before her disappearance from the compound. The realization that Emma had managed to get one last message to the outside world filled investigators with both hope and dread, hope that she had planned for this moment, and dread that her captors might have discovered her activities. Analysis of financial records seized from the compound revealed that the Covenant operated several additional properties throughout the southeastern United States. Bank transfers, property deeds, and communication records pointed to facilities in Georgia, Virginia, and eastern Tennessee, all registered under various aliases connected to Ezekiel Crowder and his inner circle. Each location appeared to serve a different function within the organization. Some focused on recruitment and indoctrination, others on labor and production, and at least one that seemed designed specifically for isolation and punishment. The most promising lead came from cell phone records found in Crowder's possession. Despite the group's official prohibition on outside communication, leadership maintained phones for coordinating between facilities and managing their external operations. The record showed frequent calls to a number registered to a property in Polk County, Tennessee, just 40 miles from where Emma had originally disappeared in Millbrook. The proximity was too significant to be coincidental, and investigators immediately began surveillance of the Tennessee location. The Polk County property was smaller than the North Carolina compound, but exhibited many of the same security features: high fences, limited access, and buildings designed to house multiple residents. Satellite imagery showed recent construction activity, including what appeared to be an underground structure that wasn't visible in older photographs. The property was registered to a woman named Mary Crawford, believed to be Crowder's sister, who had no criminal record, but whose financial records showed suspicious transactions that aligned with the Covenant's operations. While surveillance teams monitored the Tennessee property, forensic analysts continued processing evidence from Emma's sketchbook. Her final drawings revealed details about the compound's layout that hadn't been apparent to investigators during the raid, including hidden rooms and underground areas that required further exploration. More importantly, her artwork included what appeared to be a schedule or calendar, with specific dates marked and coded symbols that might indicate planned movements between facilities. The breakthrough came when FBI cryptographers working with Emma's codes realized that her final drawings weren't just documenting her current situation, they were predicting future events. The calendar symbols corresponded to dates when transfers between facilities typically occurred, and the most recent markings suggested that she expected to be moved in late July or early August 2023. The precision of her predictions indicated that Emma had gained access to operational information that went far beyond what a typical captive would know. This discovery led investigators to re-examine Emma's role within the organization. Rather than being simply a victim held against her will, she appeared to have positioned herself as a trusted member of the community while secretly gathering intelligence about the group's entire network. Her artistic assignments had given her access to leadership meetings, financial records, and communication with external contacts, opportunities she had used to build a comprehensive picture of the Covenant's criminal operations. Agent Chen coordinated with tactical teams to plan simultaneous operations at all known Covenant properties. The goal was to prevent the organization's remaining leadership from destroying evidence or harming potential victims who might be held at other locations. The Tennessee property received priority attention because of its proximity to Emma's original disappearance and the evidence suggesting she might have been taken there. Sheriff Bradley, now officially serving as a consultant to the federal task force, provided crucial local knowledge about the terrain and community around the Polk County property. He had patrolled these areas for decades and knew the back roads, hiding places, and local residents who might have observed suspicious activity. His insight proved valuable in planning approach routes and identifying potential escape routes that the group's members might use if they detected law enforcement activity. The psychological profile of Emma that emerged from witness testimony and analysis of her artwork painted a picture of remarkable resilience and determination. Despite years of captivity and abuse, she had maintained her sense of identity and had worked systematically to expose her captors. Her artistic talent, which had initially made her a target for abduction, had become her greatest tool for resistance and eventual rescue. As preparations for the Tennessee operation moved forward, investigators faced the grim reality that they might be too late to save Emma. The evidence suggested that the group's leadership had become suspicious of her activities and had moved to eliminate the threat she represented. But her documentation had provided law enforcement with the tools needed to dismantle the entire criminal network, ensuring that other victims could be rescued and that those responsible would face justice. The operation was scheduled for dawn, with multiple teams coordinating across several states to strike simultaneously at all known Covenant facilities. For David and Linda Henderson, who had waited 16 years for answers about their daughter's fate, this day would either bring the reunion they had prayed for or the terrible confirmation of their worst fears. Either way, Emma's courage and determination had already ensured that her story would not end in silence. The pre-dawn darkness on October 15, 2023, carried a weight of anticipation that seemed to settle over the Tennessee mountains like a shroud. FBI tactical teams positioned themselves around the Polk County property, while Agent Chen coordinated communications with simultaneous operations targeting Covenant facilities across 4 states. The synchronized raids were designed to prevent the remaining leadership from warning each other or destroying evidence, but everyone involved understood that they were racing against time to find Emma Henderson before it was too late. Sheriff Bradley, now wearing a federal consultant badge that felt strange after decades of local law enforcement, positioned himself with the command team overlooking the Tennessee compound. Through night vision scopes, he could see the layout that Emma had so carefully documented in her sketches: a main house, several outbuildings, and the newer underground structure that had appeared in recent satellite imagery. The property sat in a hollow between wooded hills, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through several miles of forest. The intelligence gathered from the North Carolina raid had revealed that this Tennessee facility served as both a punishment location for rebellious members and a secure site where the group's leadership could disappear if their other operations were discovered. The underground structure appeared to be designed for long-term concealment, with sophisticated ventilation systems and what appeared to be living quarters built below ground level. If Emma was still alive, this hidden facility would be the most likely place to find her. As the first tactical teams moved into position, Agent Chen received updates from the other operations occurring simultaneously across the region. The Georgia facility had been secured without resistance, yielding a dozen rescued victims and crucial financial records. The Virginia property had been abandoned recently, but forensic teams were processing evidence left behind. Each success increased the pressure on the Tennessee operation, which appeared to house the most dangerous members of the organization, and potentially the most important evidence. The assault on the main compound began at exactly 6 a.m., with teams advancing from multiple directions to prevent escape. Unlike the North Carolina facility, where residents had submitted passively to law enforcement, the Tennessee location showed immediate signs of resistance. Armed guards attempted to delay the tactical teams while other individuals could be seen moving quickly between buildings, apparently destroying documents and equipment. The main house yielded several members of the Covenant's inner circle, including Mary Crawford, who claimed to know nothing about any missing persons or criminal activities. But it was the discovery of the entrance to the underground facility that validated Emma's intelligence and proved that her documentation had been accurate, even in the smallest details. Hidden beneath what appeared to be a storm cellar, investigators found a sophisticated tunnel system leading to multiple underground rooms. The underground complex was more extensive than surface surveillance had suggested, containing living quarters, storage areas, and what appeared to be a communication center with equipment for monitoring law enforcement radio frequencies. The facility had been designed for long-term occupation by people who needed to remain hidden from outside detection. Most disturbing was evidence that the complex had been used to hold people against their will, with reinforced doors, barred windows, and rooms that could only be locked from the outside. In the deepest section of the underground facility, investigators found evidence of recent occupation, personal belongings, medications, and artwork that immediately caught Agent Chen's attention. The drawings were unmistakably Emma's work, but they showed a progression in style and content that suggested she had continued developing her artistic abilities even under the most difficult circumstances. These recent pieces were more sophisticated than her earlier work, incorporating complex symbolic elements that seemed to tell a story of survival and resistance. But Emma herself was not in the underground facility, nor anywhere else on the property. The evidence suggested that she had been held there recently. Investigators found clothing in her size, personal items that matched descriptions from her family, and artwork dated just weeks before the raid. The absence of any person matching Emma's description among the individuals found on the property created a desperate urgency among the search teams. Under interrogation, Mary Crawford eventually revealed that Emma had been transferred to what she called a, quote, secure location, when the group's leadership became aware that law enforcement was investigating their operations. She claimed not to know the specific location, but admitted that contingency plans existed for moving high-value prisoners to places that weren't connected to any known Covenant properties. The implication was that Emma might be held at a location that wasn't in any of their seized records or surveillance targets. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, one of the armed guards captured during the initial assault. James Wheeler, a 34-year-old former military contractor who had joined the Covenant after struggling with PTSD and addiction, agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Wheeler revealed that he had been tasked with transporting Emma to a cabin deep in the Cherokee National Forest, a location chosen specifically because it was federal land where the group had no official presence and where searches would be difficult to conduct. According to Wheeler, the cabin was a survival shelter that Crowder had established years earlier as a final retreat if the organization's activities were discovered. It was located in a remote section of the National Forest, accessible only by hiking trails and designed to be invisible to aerial surveillance. Emma had been taken there with supplies for an extended stay, but Wheeler admitted that he had been ordered to eliminate her if it became clear that law enforcement was getting close to finding the location. Wheeler's revelation sent immediate urgency through the investigation team. If Emma was still alive at the forest location, they had a narrow window of opportunity to reach her before other members of the organization realized that Wheeler had been captured and decided to tie up loose ends. Agent Chen coordinated with National Park Service law enforcement and local search and rescue teams to plan an immediate operation to locate and secure the cabin. The search through the Cherokee National Forest would require different tactics than the previous raids. The terrain was rugged and heavily forested, with no roads leading to the cabin's location. Wheeler provided approximate coordinates based on his memory of the route, but admitted that he had been intentionally kept somewhat ignorant of the exact location to prevent him from revealing it under pressure. The search teams would need to cover several square miles of wilderness while moving quickly enough to reach Emma before it was too late. As helicopters lifted off carrying search teams toward the National Forest, Sheriff Bradley found himself thinking about the 16-year journey that had led to this moment. From that terrible Sunday afternoon when Emma had disappeared from Miller's Creek, to this desperate search through mountain wilderness, the case had consumed his career and haunted his dreams. Now, finally, they might be hours away from learning Emma Henderson's fate and bringing her home to the family that had never stopped believing she would return. The Cherokee National Forest stretched endlessly beneath the helicopters, carrying federal agents and search teams toward what they hoped would be Emma Henderson's final location. Agent Chen studied topographical maps while coordinating with ground teams that were approaching the target area from multiple directions. After 16 years of searching, the investigation had narrowed to a few square miles of Tennessee wilderness where a young woman's fate would finally be determined. The coordinates provided by James Wheeler led the search teams to a section of the forest that rarely saw visitors, too remote for casual hikers but not designated as official wilderness area. The terrain was challenging, with steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and streams that could conceal or wash away evidence of human presence. It was exactly the kind of location where someone could disappear completely, whether by choice or by force. Sheriff Bradley, despite his age and official retirement, had insisted on joining the ground search team. He carried with him a photograph of 16-year-old Emma Henderson, the same image that had been distributed during the initial search in 2007. As he pushed through mountain laurel and over fallen logs, he found himself imagining the girl he remembered, artistic, faithful, beloved by her community, surviving years of captivity through intelligence and determination that no one could have predicted. The first sign that they were approaching their target came from a detection dog that alerted to human scent near a rocky outcropping. The area showed subtle signs of human activity, disturbed vegetation, carefully concealed trash, and what appeared to be a faint trail leading further into the forest. The search teams followed these traces with growing excitement, knowing they were close to answers that had eluded them for 16 years. The cabin, when they finally found it, was almost invisible, even from a few yards away. Built into a natural depression and camouflaged with local materials, it would have been nearly impossible to locate without Wheeler's information. The structure was larger than expected, clearly designed for extended occupation, with solar panels hidden among the trees and what appeared to be a sophisticated water collection system. Someone had invested significant effort in making this location suitable for long-term survival. Agent Chen approached the cabin with tactical teams positioned around the perimeter, unsure whether they would encounter resistance or find Emma alive inside. The building showed signs of recent occupation. Smoke had risen from a concealed chimney within the past day, and fresh footprints were visible in the soft earth around the entrance. But the silence was complete, with no sounds of human activity coming from within the structure. The door was unlocked, opening to reveal a single room that contained everything needed for basic survival: food supplies, water containers, sleeping area, and basic medical supplies. But it was the artwork covering the walls that confirmed they had found Emma's final location. Every available surface was covered with drawings, paintings, and mixed media pieces that told the story of her captivity, survival, and ultimate resistance against those who had held her. The artwork was unlike anything Emma had created during her earlier captivity. These pieces showed an artistic maturity and emotional depth that spoke to years of growth and development, even under the most difficult circumstances. Portraits of fellow captives, landscapes of the various locations where she had been held, and abstract pieces that seemed to process trauma and hope in equal measure covered the walls like a visual diary of her experience. But Emma herself was not in the cabin. A thorough search of the structure and surrounding area revealed no sign of recent occupation, though the artwork appeared to have been created over several months. The mystery deepened when investigators found a note written in Emma's distinctive handwriting, dated just 3 days earlier. "They're coming for me, but I'm ready. I've left the truth where people will find it. Tell my parents I never stopped believing I would see them again." The search teams expanded their efforts, combing the surrounding forest for any sign of where Emma might have gone. It was Sheriff Bradley who found the trail leading away from the cabin toward a series of rocky ledges that provided views of the valley below. The path was subtle but deliberate, marked by small cairns of stacked stones that suggested someone had intended for others to follow their route. The trail led to a natural amphitheater formed by rock walls, where investigators made a discovery that would change everything. Emma Henderson was there, alive but weak, having survived on minimal food and water for several days while waiting for rescue that she somehow knew was coming. She had heard the helicopters approaching and had positioned herself where she could be easily found, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. At 32 years old, Emma bore little physical resemblance to the 16-year-old girl who had disappeared from Miller's Creek. Years of hardship had aged her, but her eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had allowed her to survive and ultimately expose the criminal organization that had held her captive. She was dehydrated and malnourished but alert, and her first words were to ask about her parents and whether they were still alive. The reunion between Emma and her parents took place at a hospital in Knoxville, where she was being treated for the effects of her ordeal. David and Linda Henderson, now in their 70s and marked by 16 years of grief and uncertainty, could barely believe they were finally holding their daughter again. The moment was both joyful and heartbreaking, as they struggled to reconcile the strong woman before them with their memories of the teenage girl who had vanished so long ago. Emma's testimony over the following weeks provided investigators with the final pieces needed to dismantle what remained of the Covenant of the Sacred Harvest. Her detailed knowledge of the organization's operations, finances, and membership led to dozens of additional arrests and the rescue of victims who had been held at locations not discovered during the initial raids. Her artistic documentation had preserved evidence that would be crucial in prosecuting those responsible for years of criminal activity. The legal proceedings that followed would take years to complete, but Emma's survival ensured that justice could be served for the crimes committed against her and countless other victims. Ezekiel Crowder and his inner circle faced federal charges for kidnapping, human trafficking, and numerous other crimes, with Emma's testimony serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. For the community of Millbrook, Emma's return represented the answer to prayers that had been offered for 16 years. The church where her grandmother's Bible had been discovered held a special service of thanksgiving, and the town that had never forgotten her welcomed her home with a celebration that mixed joy with recognition of all the years that had been lost. Emma herself faced the difficult process of rebuilding a life that had been interrupted at 16 and resumed at 32. She had missed her high school graduation, college, the normal milestones of young adulthood. But she had also developed a strength and artistic vision that transformed her experience into something meaningful. Her artwork from captivity would eventually be displayed in galleries and museums as testimony to the power of human resilience and the importance of never giving up hope. In the quiet moments after the media attention faded and the legal proceedings moved forward, Emma often returned to Miller's Creek, where her story had begun 16 years earlier. She would sit by the water where she had once sketched water lilies, now drawing new images that reflected her journey from victim to survivor to witness. The creek continued to flow as it always had, carrying away the past while nurturing new growth along its banks. Her parents, amazed by their daughter's strength and grateful for her return, learned to balance their joy at having her home with recognition of the trauma she had endured. The family that had been broken by her disappearance was slowly healing, though they all understood that some wounds would take time to close completely. The Henderson farm, which had felt empty and purposeless during Emma's absence, came alive again with her presence. She converted part of the old barn into an art studio, where she created works that processed her experience while looking toward a future that finally felt possible. The drawings that had once been hidden in the margins of Bibles now flowed freely onto canvases, telling stories of survival, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. If stories like Emma's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.